Lower Manhattan, September 11th, 2001, 8:46 a.m. The North Tower has already been struck. Smoke moves upward in a steady column. Inside, thousands remain at their desks, in stairwells, on upper floors, waiting for instructions that have not yet reached them. Among them is a man who, for years, had warned that something like this could happen. Not in abstract terms, not as distant theory. He had traced networks, reviewed intercepted communications, studied previous attacks against American targets. He had argued that al-Qaeda was patient, organized, and determined to strike inside the United States. He believed aviation would be central. He believed iconic structures were vulnerable. He believed the threat was not receding. On this morning, he is no longer inside a federal building. He is no longer issuing warnings from Washington. Weeks earlier, he accepted a new position as head of security at the World Trade Center complex. The building he once described as a potential target is now his workplace. John P. O'Neill had spent much of the 1990s pursuing a network he considered the most serious external threat to the country. His assessments often placed him in conflict with bureaucratic limitations and interagency boundaries. His warnings were documented, debated, and sometimes contested. On September 11th, 2001, he was inside the North Tower when the first aircraft struck. This episode examines the trajectory of a counter-terrorism investigator who identified a pattern long before it reached its most visible form, and whose final assignment placed him at the center of the event he had worked to prevent. Inside locked doors. The threat before the impact. During the 1990s, the architecture of international terrorism shifted in scale and ambition. The 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center marked an early indication that American infrastructure could be directly targeted. The attack, carried out using a truck bomb in the underground parking garage, failed to bring down the towers, but demonstrated intent. It introduced a new variable into domestic security calculations. Symbolic structures were not immune. Over the next several years, intelligence agencies tracked the rise of a decentralized extremist network operating across Afghanistan, Sudan, Yemen, and parts of East Africa. The name al-Qaeda became increasingly present in classified briefings. In 1998, coordinated bombings struck U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The attacks killed more than 200 people and injured thousands. Investigations linked the operation to Osama bin Laden and his organization. In 2000, the USS Cole was attacked in the port of Aden, Yemen. A small explosive-laden boat approached the naval destroyer and detonated alongside it. 17 U.S. sailors were killed. By the turn of the millennium, intelligence assessments reflected a pattern. Al-Qaeda was capable of complex planning, patient execution, and transnational coordination. Reports indicated an intention to strike American targets, including within the United States. However, intelligence during this period was fragmented. Agencies collected data through separate channels. Legal distinctions between intelligence gathering and criminal investigation limited the extent to which information could be shared. The term "connect the dots" would later become shorthand for systemic failure, but at the time, the structure was defined by compartmentalization. Warnings existed. Threat advisories were issued. Presidential daily briefs referenced the possibility of attacks involving aviation. Yet these warnings did not specify date, location, or operational details sufficient to trigger preventive action at a national scale. The threat environment was recognized as serious but diffuse. It was understood in strategic terms, not as an imminent coordinated event involving domestic commercial aircraft. Within this context, certain investigators began to focus more intensely on the emerging pattern. One of them was John P. O'Neill. John P. O'Neill and the counter-terrorism system John Patrick O'Neill joined the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1976. Over 2 decades, he developed a reputation as an assertive and detail-oriented investigator. By the mid-1990s, he was appointed special agent in charge of the FBI's National Security Division in New York, one of the Bureau's most critical field offices. New York was strategically significant. It housed major financial institutions, international organizations, and infrastructure previously targeted in 1993. It also became a central node for counter-terrorism investigations linked to al-Qaeda. O'Neill was instrumental in pursuing leads after the 1998 embassy bombings. He worked closely with foreign partners, including authorities in Yemen, to gather intelligence on networks associated with bin Laden. Colleagues later described him as deeply focused on the al-Qaeda threat, viewing it as the primary external danger facing the United States. The structure in which O'Neill operated was complex. The FBI functioned primarily as a law enforcement agency tasked with gathering evidence admissible in court. The Central Intelligence Agency, by contrast, focused on foreign intelligence collection. Legal and procedural boundaries limited direct information sharing between the two. During the investigation into the USS Cole bombing, tensions emerged over access to intelligence and jurisdictional authority. Reports indicate that O'Neill sought broader cooperation and greater urgency in addressing al-Qaeda's expanding capabilities. Inside the FBI, administrative pressures also existed. Resource allocation required prioritization. Terrorism was one of multiple competing concerns, including organized crime, counterintelligence, and financial fraud. O'Neill advocated for sustained attention to the al-Qaeda network. He argued that prior attacks demonstrated escalation rather than isolated incidents. He believed aviation security vulnerabilities and symbolic targets remained attractive to adversaries. In mid-2001, following internal disputes and scrutiny related to administrative matters, O'Neill left the FBI. His departure was not framed publicly as a strategic disagreement over terrorism policy, but it marked the end of his formal role within federal counterterrorism operations. Within weeks, he accepted a position in the private sector as Director of Security for the World Trade Center complex in New York City. The transition placed him in direct responsibility for the protection of one of the most recognizable targets in the country. The structural system he had operated within for years, defined by intelligence assessments, jurisdictional boundaries, and institutional constraints, was now behind him. In its place was a different kind of security responsibility, focused on infrastructure rather than investigation. The date was late August 2001. 2 weeks later, the threat environment he had studied for nearly a decade would manifest in a form that reshaped national security policy permanently. Se quiser, desenvolvo agora os subtitles 3 e 4. Mantendo o mesmo ritmo técnico e investigativo. From Warning to Vulnerability. In late August 2001, John P. O'Neill began his new role as Director of Security for the World Trade Center. The position placed him in charge of overseeing safety protocols across a complex that included the Twin Towers and surrounding buildings. The World Trade Center was not unfamiliar with terrorism. The 1993 bombing had already exposed structural and procedural weaknesses. In the years that followed, upgrades were implemented. Security coordination improved. Evacuation procedures were revised. Communication systems were reviewed. Yet the complex remained what it had always been, a dense vertical environment housing tens of thousands of daily occupants. Elevators moved continuously. Access points were numerous. Commercial aviation passed overhead as part of routine air traffic patterns. O'Neill's role focused on coordination, working with building management, private contractors, local law enforcement, and emergency services. The position did not grant federal intelligence authority. It was infrastructure security, not counter-terrorism investigation. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, O'Neill was inside the North Tower. Reports indicate he had arrived early for meetings related to tenant security coordination. At 8:46 a.m., and American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower between the 93rd and 99th floors. The initial impact created confusion rather than immediate clarity. Many inside the building believed it to be an accident. Emergency response procedures were activated according to available information at the time. O'Neill was last seen assisting with evacuation efforts. Witnesses later reported that he moved toward areas where coordination was needed, rather than exiting immediately. Official records confirm that he did not leave the building before its collapse at 10:28 a.m. His death was later confirmed through identification processes conducted in the weeks that followed. The investigator, who had spent years analyzing al-Qaeda's operational methods, was now among the thousands killed in the first successful large-scale attack carried out by the organization on U.S. soil. The vulnerability he had studied was no longer theoretical. Prediction, narrative, and institutional consequence. In the years after September 11th, public discussion increasingly framed John O'Neill as the man who predicted 9/11. The term requires clarification. O'Neill did not possess specific intelligence regarding the exact date, aircraft, or operational details of the September 11th attacks. There is no documented evidence that he knew of the precise plot as executed. What he did articulate, consistently and on record, was the strategic trajectory of al-Qaeda. He assessed that the organization intended to strike inside the United States. He warned that aviation could be used creatively. He viewed iconic economic targets as symbolically powerful objectives. His position reflected a broader intelligence concern shared by other analysts. However, O'Neill was among the most vocal in arguing that the threat was escalating and required sustained prioritization. After the attacks, institutional reform followed. The Department of Homeland Security was created in 2002. The Director of National Intelligence position was established to improve coordination across agencies. Information-sharing protocols between the FBI and CIA were restructured. The USA Patriot Act expanded investigative authorities. The phrase "failure of imagination" entered official discourse, notably within the 9/11 Commission report. The report concluded that while warning signs existed, agencies struggled to synthesize fragmented intelligence into actionable prevention. O'Neill's story became emblematic of that gap, not as proof of foreknowledge, but as representation of systemic friction. His career highlights the tension between strategic assessment and operational readiness, between identifying patterns and preventing specific events. In retrospect, the narrative of prediction carries symbolic weight. It suggests inevitability, yet the institutional record reflects complexity rather than certainty. Threat environments evolve gradually. Bureaucracies adapt incrementally. Catastrophic events often appear clearer in hindsight than in real time. John P. O'Neill's trajectory intersects with that reality. He spent years focused on a network he believed would strike decisively. In his final weeks, he stood inside one of the most visible symbols of American infrastructure. The system he worked within would be reorganized after his death. The questions his career raises about prioritization, coordination, and response to emerging threats remain part of ongoing national security debates. Inside locked doors,